Pope came to me and said, I need you to hear my confession. I need to confess. The Pope was making his confession to this man who became a beggar. So the priest was stunned. He says, he confessed to you? He said, yes. And then I objected. I said, Your Holiness, I'm not even a priest anymore. I'm a beggar on the street. He says, no, you are a priest. And I need to confess. And you will hear my confession. And then he says, the priest friend, he asked him, so the Pope confessed for 20 minutes? He said, no. After he confessed, then I said, Your Holiness, now you hear my confession. And I confessed. And then he said, and then what happened? He says, then afterwards, he appointed me to be a priest serving those beggars in front of those churches. He gave me this assignment, to be a priest to serve those beggars in front of those churches. So, it's a beautiful story. But what raised this man up was the Pope humbling himself, right? Humbling himself before him and saying, take my confession. Right? So, the power to change people is in us when we humble ourselves before them. When you lower yourself before others in real humility, you change them. You change them. So, this is the number 5 then, to humble ourselves before others. Especially to humble ourselves before those who are inferior to us. So, the final point then is that we are free through this love, this enlarged heart, this love that includes everyone, our friends and our enemies. This is freedom for us. Think of it this way. When your heart is full of one of the saints, he gave this analogy. He says, suppose we're sitting in this church and it's packed in here, standing room only, so that if one more person tries to come into the church, there's no room. He says that's exactly what happens when the heart is full of the love of God and the love of neighbor. The other things that are trying to get in, the passions, the sins, the fleshly desires, the desires of this world, when they come knocking on the door of your heart, what's going to happen? There's no room, because it's filled with the love of God and the love of man. But if your heart is empty with the love of God and the love of man, then what will happen? Anything that seeks to come in will find plenty of space to dwell. So that's why the saints, they sought to exclude everything except the love of God and love of neighbor, and especially the love of enemies. Because they knew that if their heart was full of this love, then all of the other things would disappear. Right? So this is the positive approach to the spiritual life. Sometimes we, in the spiritual life, we try to chase after sin. Right? So for example, I have a problem with anger, and I focus on anger, and I try to deal with anger, and I find myself spinning my wheels. I'm not accomplishing anything. Pick any sin. Right? And we begin to define our spiritual life in terms of overcoming this sin or that sin. But the approach of the saints is different. They work positively. Right? The positive approach is to love God and love your neighbor. And again, when the heart is full of this love, and God sees that you are open to His love, and He will pour more love into you, then your desire for other things, your desire for your own self-will, your desire for the fleshly desires, all of these things, they lose their appeal. They lose their appeal. Right? So don't focus on the spiritual life by just focusing on sin. Because usually we don't achieve much in this way. The greater result comes when we focus in growing positively in our love for God and love for neighbor. Right? So reading the scriptures, prayer, the church, all of these things are to increase that love. And then usually the fight against sin becomes easier. And this is what, again, one of the spiritual fathers, he says, others try to become holy by fighting against their passions and their sins, and others by loving Christ and His will. The former achieve only a few things, because their effort is very cold and hard. The latter achieve a lot more, because by loving Christ, sinful passions lose their appeal and power before the joy and love of Christ that they feel. When dawn breaks and the light of the sun enters your room, all the darkness leaves immediately and unavoidably. So one of the saints, he had this beautiful expression. He says, my heart only has entrances, it has no exits. Whoever enters remains there. Whatever he may do, I love him the same as I loved him when he first entered my heart. I pray for him and seek his salvation. I think if each one of us analyzes our own life, and we ask ourselves how many people entered our hearts but then exited. I'm sure we can think of many people. But as he says, his heart only has entrances, no exits. Again, the idea of enlarging the heart. Everybody that we come into contact with, good, bad, friend, foe, the heart has to be open for them. This is, again, going back to the beginning, the cross, right? The Lord with His outstretched arms as a sign of embracing everybody, even His very enemies, even the ones who were mocking Him at the foot of the cross. His arms were outstretched for them. So as you go into your Holy Week, and as you begin to contemplate on the cross of Christ, I want you to have this image of when you see the crucified Lord with His arms outstretched. I want you to have this contemplation in your heart, this embracing love of Christ, and His asking each of us to have that same embracing love that includes everyone. So, if you have any questions or comments. I think the younger ones, I lost them, huh? It's hard when you have different age groups to tailor it to. But I see a lot of older youth, so I hope that what I spoke was something that you could follow. And was it practical or was it just theoretical? Okay, good.
It's practical but not difficult.
It is, but that's why I said, when we confront the commandments of Christ, we are humbled because we know that we don't have the human power to fulfill them. But this humbling ourselves before God and crying out to Him then opens the way for Him to act in us by His grace. Right? Even one of the fathers, he says, we don't read the lives of the saints because we want to imitate them. We cannot imitate the lives of the saints. He says we read the lives of the saints to be humbled by them and their actions. And when we're humbled, then we can cry out to God, and then He can work in us. Right? So we don't read the lives of the saints thinking that we're going to imitate them. No, this is pride. But we read the lives of the saints in order to be humbled, to be crushed. So the heart is crushed, and when the heart is crushed, then it can cry out to God, and then God can work in us. Right? So humility and falling again, begging. One of my name is Kylloris, which is named after, I was speaking about one of our patriarchs who died in 1971. He had the name Kylloris VI. And he was a very saintly man. He did a lot of miracles, and he was a very, very holy man. And I was so fascinated by his life when I was a teenager. That's why I took his name in my ordination. But I asked my spiritual father, I said, what was the secret to his life? He was so powerful. I mean, he was a man of prayer, humble, miracle worker. the secret in his life? And he gave me a very simple but profound answer. He said he was a beggar. I said, what do you mean? He says, you know a beggar? A beggar is on this corner of the street. He knows he's homeless. He knows he's naked. He knows he's poor. And he begs. He says, our problem is that we don't beg. We think we're clothed. We think we're rich. We think we possess. We think we're good. And because of this, we don't beg God for His grace. But he says, this man begged God for grace day in and day out. And that's why God kept giving him. And I think this is really like a great theological answer to who the saints are. They were beggars. Beggars for the grace of God. So we need to, again, to beg means we need to first see that we are poor. So the self-knowledge is very important in the spiritual life. Self-knowledge. To know yourself. Once you know yourself, then you can see who you are in truth, to begin to ask God to fill you with His love and His grace. Yes. Yeah, in the Coptic tradition, every priest has a hand cross, and usually always carries it when preaching, even in most of the prayers of the church, even many parts of the Divine Liturgy. When he blesses the people, he always blesses with the cross. Usually when in confession, when we read the absolution, we put the cross on the head of the person and read the absolution. So it's part of the Coptic tradition that we always carry a hand cross. Yeah. And the Indian Orthodox is only for bishops, or?
For the bishops, because of this day.
I'm not trying to act like a bishop. I'm just a priest. But no, in the Coptic tradition, every priest, when he's ordained, is given like a hand cross, and he uses it. So.
This is the cross that you got?
No, this cross was my spiritual father's cross. My spiritual father was ordained in 1962, and he just celebrated 50 years of priesthood. And he's in San Francisco, and when I last visited, I told him, I need something from you that is, precious to you to give to me. So he gave me this, cross. And actually, in Arabic, it has his name written on it, the Hegomin, or the proto-priest, Matthias Wahba. His name is Father Matthias. So it was a gift from my spiritual father to me. But I also have a cross that was given to me by my bishop when I was ordained.
That's the Orthodox tradition. That's your cross, the chain. That's a crucial cross on the crucifix cross. Especially that's the Orthodox churches they want to.
The crucifix? Well, this actually is more of a Byzantine. This cross was a gift from somebody, gave to me from Jerusalem. There's more, but we have in the Coptic tradition, most of our crosses do not show the crucifix. It's just which is more the Orthodox way. You're right. I don't know. I mean, in Egypt, a lot of the crosses are like leather crosses, and there's no crucifix on it, or wooden crosses with no crucifix. The crucifix tends to be more of a Catholic. But I see also in the Indian Orthodox, the priests do not wear a pectoral cross.
They wear. They want the crucifixion is not.
A few sentences about the Coptic Church.
Well, the Coptic Church has almost always been under persecution. I mean, if you think about St. Mark, the apostle, one of the four evangelists, the gospel writers, was the one who went to Egypt to preach and established the Church of Alexandria in the middle of the 1st century. And of course, Egypt at that time was a pagan country. And the church in Egypt was very famous during the Roman persecution. Even Tertullian was one of the church fathers in the 3rd century. He says if you put on a scale all the martyrs outside of Egypt on one and just the martyrs of Egypt on the other, it'll tilt in favor of Egypt because of how many people were killed in Egypt during the Roman persecution. Eventually, with the reign of Constantine, the whole Roman Empire became Christian. So there was a brief period where Egypt was free from persecution. But then, as you know, in our tradition, we had the split with the Byzantine churches in the Council of Chalcedon. And they persecuted, the Byzantine emperor persecuted the Christians of Egypt, the non-Chalcedonian Christians of Egypt, and tried to impose their own patriarch. So there was also a period of Byzantine persecution. And then that led into the Arab invasion, and that was in the 7th century. And really, from the 7th century until today, the Christians have been increasingly, becoming a minority and under persecution. Today, there's been a lot of change politically in Egypt after the downfall of Hosni Mubarak, who was in power for 30-some years. And the group that is now in charge of the country was the group that was actually outlawed under Mubarak, what they call the Muslim Brotherhood. They were an illegal organization, and most of their leaders were imprisoned under Mubarak as a fanatical Muslim organization. And unfortunately now they are the ones in power in the country. So you can imagine, from a religious standpoint, the fear and the tensions that exist now in the streets. We have seen in the last few years a tremendous number of people leaving Egypt. They come in any way they can. They come on any kind of visitor's visa, and then they file for asylum. And increasingly it's being granted to them because the US government is aware of what's happening in Egypt. So our churches in LA, in New York, and just the areas that we have large populations of Coptic people, some of our churches, 5 families a week, in just a single church every week are coming from Egypt. We don't know, of course, what the future holds, but we believe, of course, in the power of our Lord to protect His church. There's a story during one of the Russian czars sent a delegation, and this was in the 1800s, to Egypt, and with a message to the delegation to meet with our patriarch, asking if they wanted our protection. So the Russians were saying, give us permission and we will protect the Christians of Egypt, and you won't be persecuted, because at the time Russia was more powerful than Egypt. And the Coptic patriarch, he asked the delegation, he says, let me ask you a question, does your emperor, does your czar, does he die? Of course, he's human. Every human being dies. He says, well, our king doesn't die. Right? Our king, the Lord, he doesn't die. So, thank you, but we are under the care of the king who doesn't die. The church has survived. Roman, Byzantine, Arab, and of course the Arabs are different. There was Turkish, and there were different kinds of Arab reigns in Egypt. So we trust, and we hope, of course, but we also acknowledge that the church could be going through a time of persecution. The church may be offering martyrs during this next period of time. And, we have to pray that we have the strength to accept it. If this is what the Lord wants for us, then we see the blessing in it. Again, they asked, in the early church, one of the fathers, he says to the Romans that were killing the Christians, he says, the more you cut us down, the more we grow. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. The more you cut us down, the more we grow. So there is a hidden, of course, blessing and grace in persecution. But we pray for the strength of those Christians who are suffering, not just in Egypt, but in Syria, in Iraq, in India, Pakistan, of course, in Iran. There's persecution in China. I mean, many countries now, the Christians are being persecuted. Again, look at Russia. Russia, under communism, they killed millions of Christians. They slaughtered clergy, bishops, priests. And now the church in Russia is reviving. Communism is dead. So, in other places like Romania and all of these places where communism, they tried to wipe out the faith, through all kinds of methods. They didn't succeed. So we know, because we believe in the true God, that whatever they do, whatever persecution we experience in any place, the faith will never die. But we accept that it may be a time that the church is going through persecution and may be offering more martyrs for the church. Of course, the government will never say, even though they have the official numbers, because every person in Egypt is required to have an ID card and it states their religion. So every single person in Egypt is registered and they know. But they tend to, say, 7%, 5%. But we know as a church that it is closer to almost 20%, 15 to 20%. And there are many conversions that are taking place. Hundreds of thousands of Muslims converting to Christianity in Egypt. We have, even in our parish, just in Irvine, we have many converts. And some of the churches, they have whole groups that are converts. Even here and in Egypt. In Egypt, of course, they cannot speak about it. They have to, when they're baptized quietly and hiding, and nobody knows. Because if they know in Egypt, usually they can be killed, even by their own families. Their own families will be the ones because it's a disgrace for them. Here, they can be open about it. So we have, even in some of our churches, we have meetings just for converts. Whole Bible studies to help converts get integrated into the church. But we have many converts that escaped from Egypt, and now they're in our churches here. And I don't know, Father. I mean, but it's too little for the number of Christians. I mean, we have, in some of the churches, because, in Egypt, up until recently, there was an Ottoman rule that any church needed presidential decree to build a church. You could not build a church unless you cannot even repair a church without a presidential decree. Like if the toilet is broken, it's really. So under Mubarak, they kind of played a game. They changed it from the president to the governor. But now it made it worse, because the governors, they just play games. You apply, and we have to study, we have to ask, and they wait years and years before they give you approval. So what happens is that they're forced to build what they call service buildings. They say it's not a church, it's just for Sunday school, for meetings, and then they start using it and secretly praying in it until they can get the approval to make it as a church. So most of the churches, you'll find churches that have 25 priests, liturgies 3-4 times a day, every day, because they have 8,000 families for one church. So they have to have services every day, and they keep ordaining priests for the same church. So the number of churches is not equal, of course, to the number of Christians, but I don't know the number.
Is the Celtic cross on your wrist, is that a tradition that started, was a result of the persecution?
Yeah, the tradition, the history behind it is, there's a couple of theories. One was that at a certain time, they made the Christians wear these heavy chains with crosses on them, and it was so heavy that it would cause this blue bone, we call it blue bone effect, whatever. So when that period ended, the Christians started to put the same kind of color cross on the wrist as a commemoration or a sign of pride. The other is that occasionally Christians are kidnapped, especially Christian women are kidnapped, and so if they're kidnapped and killed, at least they're identifiable by the cross. So now, I had this done after I was living here, and I went on a trip to Egypt, and we were a youth group. I was in college, and we were a youth group, and we decided to do it just out of tradition, just as a pride, kind of a thing, cultural pride, I guess. But it's not required, and we don't necessarily encourage it. But it is part of. You find a lot of Christians in Egypt that have the cross on their wrist. Thank you very much. Glory be to God. Now we're going to stage.
Thank you, Father, for that really enlightening message for us. I want to thank you for taking this time out. He has a very busy schedule.
Let me give thanks to Father Kylloris Abraham for his presence and doing his work.